The Galactic Cartography Guild had been mapping the stars for over 12,000 cycles. Their charts were trusted by every spacefaring civilization in the known universe. Traders used them to find safe routes. Explorers used them to discover new worlds. Governments used them to expand their borders, but there was one small region of space that every chart marked the same way. A tiny spiral arm on the edge of the galaxy bore the oldest warning anyone had ever seen. The words were simple and clear. Here be monsters. No one knew who had written those words. No one knew when they had first appeared. The warning was older than any living civilization. It had been there before the Vornithi built their first starship. It had been there before the insectoid Morith discovered fire. It had been there before anyone could remember. And so, for thousands of years, every species had obeyed the warning. They stayed away from that small region of space. They did not send ships. They did not send probes. They simply drew a line on their maps and told their children never to cross it. Ambassador Kelthos of the Vornithi Consortium was an old diplomat. He had served his people for over 60 cycles. He had negotiated treaties with dozens of species. He had seen wars begin and end. He thought he had seen everything the universe had to offer. But when he stood before the High Council that morning, he knew that everything was about to change. "We have received a transmission," Kelthos announced. His 4 eyes blinked slowly as he looked at the assembled leaders. A merchant vessel was thrown off course by a hyperlane collapse. The ship drifted into the forbidden sector, and it returned. The council chamber fell silent. No ship had ever returned from that region of space. Most assumed that whatever lived there destroyed any vessel that came too close. The silence stretched for a long moment before Elder Morvith spoke. The ancient insectoid had served on the council for 300 cycles. His shell was cracked with age and his movements were slow, but his mind was still sharp. "What did they find?" Morvith asked, his mandibles clicking with each word. Kelthos took a deep breath. "They found a civilization. A species that calls themselves humans. They come from a world called Terra, and they wish to establish contact." The chamber erupted into chaos. Delegates shouted over each other. Some demanded more information. Others called for the immediate destruction of any ships attempting to leave the forbidden sector. A few simply sat in stunned silence. Unable to process what they had heard, Keltashels waited for the noise to die down before continuing. "The humans appear to be a young species. They have only been traveling among the stars for a few centuries, but they are curious. They detected our merchant vessel and made contact. They were ... friendly? Friendly?" Morvith clicked his mandibles in what passed for a laugh among his species. "The forbidden sector has been marked dangerous since before the first expansion. Our ancestors knew something we have forgotten. Whatever lives there cannot be friendly. We must not engage with these creatures." But it was already too late. The transmission from the merchant vessel had spread across the civilized worlds. News of the discovery traveled faster than any ship could fly. On thousands of planets, billions of beings were learning that the monsters of legend were real, and they wanted to talk. On the colony world of Nethros Prime, a young cartographer named Selith sat in her small office and stared at her computer screen. She was a member of the Cartography Guild, one of thousands who spent their lives updating and maintaining the great star charts. It was boring work most of the time. She checked coordinates. She verified distances. She made sure that the maps were accurate. But today, she had a different task. Selith was searching for the origin of the warning. She wanted to know who had first marked the forbidden sector as dangerous. She wanted to know why. The answer, she believed, was hidden somewhere in the ancient records. She worked through the night, pulling up files that had not been accessed in centuries. She traced the warning back through layer after layer of history. Each civilization had copied it from the one before. The Vornithi had taken it from the Crystalline Collective. The Collective had taken it from the Burning Kingdoms. The Kingdoms had taken it from the Silent Empire, and so on back and back, till Selith reached the oldest records in existence. The warning had been placed by the precursors. Selith felt her blood run cold. The precursors were not a civilization. They were a legend, a myth. Stories said they had been the first intelligent species in the galaxy. They had risen to power millions of years ago, built an empire that spanned the stars, and then vanished without a trace. Some said they had ascended to a higher plane of existence. Others said they had destroyed themselves. No one knew the truth, but they had left behind artifacts, ruins, and apparently warnings. Seleth dug deeper into the records. What she found made her hands shake. The precursors had not simply marked the forbidden sector as dangerous. They had created it. They had built that small region of space as an experiment, a test, a crucible. The ancient text was difficult to translate, but the meaning was clear. The precursors had wanted to create the ultimate survivors. They had designed a world of maximum hostility and seeded it with primitive life. Then they had waited. They had watched as evolution took its course over millions of years. They had watched as life on that world struggled and fought and died and adapted. They had watched as something new emerged from the endless competition, and then they had grown afraid. The precursors had sealed the sector. They had marked it with warnings in every language they knew. They had told future civilizations to stay away, and then they had vanished. Leaving only their charts behind, Seleth sat back in her chair and tried to process what she had learned. The humans were not monsters. They were something far more dangerous. They were the survivors of a world designed to produce the most resilient, most adaptable, most determined species possible. They were the product of millions of years of brutal, natural selection. They were exactly what the precursors had wanted to create, and now they were coming. Seleth knew she had to share this information with the SES. She had to warn them about what the humans truly were. But as she prepared her report, another thought crossed her mind. The precursors had been the most advanced civilization the galaxy had ever known. They had possessed technology that modern species could barely imagine, and they had been afraid of what they created. If the precursors, with all their power and knowledge, had sealed the forbidden sector and run away, what chance did the current civilizations have? Seleth looked out her window at the stars above Nethris Prime. Somewhere out there, in that small spiral arm on the edge of the galaxy, the humans were waiting. They had survived everything their world had thrown at them. They had clawed their way up from primitive animals to star-faring civilization. And now they wanted to meet their neighbors. The ancient chart had said here, be monsters. But it was just Terra. Just a small blue world orbiting an ordinary yellow star. Just the birthplace of humanity. Seleth wondered if the galaxy was ready for what was coming. She suspected it was not. The human ship arrived at Nexus Station on a quiet morning. The station was the largest structure in the civilized galaxy. A massive ring of metal and glass that floated in the empty space between three major trade routes. It served as neutral ground for diplomacy, a place where species that might otherwise be enemies could meet and talk. Thousands of beings lived and worked there. Millions more passed through each year. But none of them had ever seen anything like the vessel that emerged from the hyperlane that day. The ship was called the Endeavor. It was not beautiful. It was not elegant. It was not designed to impress anyone with its grace or sophistication. It was a brutal thing of sharp angles and heavy armor plating. Weapon platforms were visible along its hull, not hidden away like most diplomatic vessels, but displayed openly, almost proudly. The ship looked like it had been built for war and had seen plenty of it. Ambassador Kelthos watched the Endeavor dock from the observation deck. He had been chosen to lead the welcoming committee, a task he had accepted with mixed feelings. Part of him was curious about the humans. Part of him was terrified. The report from Seleth had reached the council 2 days ago. He knew what the humans were. He knew where they came from. And he knew that the precursors, with all their power, had been afraid of them. The airlock opened, and the human delegation stepped onto the station. There were 4 of them. They were smaller than Kelthos had expected. The tallest barely reached his chest. They had soft skin without scales or armor. They had no claws, no natural weapons that he could see. They looked fragile, weak, harmless. But Kelthos had read Seleth's report. He knew better than to trust appearances. The leader of the delegation was a female named Lisa Hartwell. She had brown hair pulled back from her face and eyes that seemed to be constantly moving, constantly watching, constantly assessing everything around her. She walked with the confidence of someone who had faced danger many times and survived. Behind her came three others. A male called Danny Kim, who moved with quick, nervous energy. A female named Maria Santos, who carried a translation device and watched everyone with intense curiosity. And a massive male called Jake Morrison, who said nothing and smiled at no one and made the Vornith. Eye guards reach for their weapons just by existing. "We come in peace," Lisa said as she approached Kelthos. The words triggered the translation systems, and 100 different species heard them in their own languages, but were prepared for alternatives. Kelthos felt a chill run through him. It was such a simple statement, such an honest one. The humans had come hoping for friendship, but they were ready for violence if needed. They expected danger. They planned for it. They embraced it. "Welcome to Nexus Station," Kelthos replied, keeping his voice steady. "The Galactic Council is eager to learn more about your people." The negotiations began that afternoon. They were unlike any diplomatic talks Kelthos had ever participated in. Most species wanted to discuss trade agreements and territorial boundaries. The humans wanted to know about threats. They asked about dangerous regions of space. They asked about hostile species. They asked about plagues and disasters and wars. They seemed obsessed with everything that could kill them. "Your people are very concerned with danger," Kelthos observed during a private meeting with Lisa. "Is your region of space particularly hostile?" Lisa smiled at him. Kelthos noticed how the expression revealed her teeth. Among most species, showing teeth was a threat display. He wondered if it meant the same thing to humans. "Our region of space is fine," Lisa said. "It's our world that shaped us. Terra has been trying to kill us since we first existed. Everything there is either predator, prey, or poison. We evolved not because our planet was kind, but because it was merciless." She pulled out a small device and projected images into the air between them. Kelthos saw creatures with rows of sharp teeth swimming through dark water. He saw massive beasts with claws and fangs stalking through forests. He saw tiny organisms that Lisa explained could kill millions of beings in days. He saw storms that flattened cities and waves that drowned coastlines and mountains that exploded with fire and destruction. "These are the things we grew up with," Lisa continued. "We learned to survive them. We learned to fight them. We learned to adapt to anything our world threw at us. And when we ran out of challenges on Terra, we went looking for new ones among the stars." Kelthos stared at the images. His homeworld was a gentle place. The worst predators there were small and easily avoided. The weather was mild. The geology was stable. His people had evolved in comfort and safety. They had never needed to become warriors because they had never faced real threats. "How did your species survive?" He asked. "How did you not go extinct?" Lisa's smile faded into something harder, something older. "We almost did. Many times. But we're stubborn. We don't give up. We don't surrender. When something tries to kill us, we find a way to kill it first. When the environment changes, we change with it. When we face a problem we can't solve, we keep trying until we solve it anyway." She leaned forward, and Kelthos found himself leaning back. "That's what humans are, Ambassador. We're survivors. Not because we're the strongest or the smartest or the fastest, but because we refuse to die. No matter what the universe throws at us, we get back up and we keep going." That evening, Kelthos walked through the lower levels of Nexus Station. He found Danny Kim in a recreational area, teaching a group of aliens a game called poker. The human was losing badly, but he didn't seem to care. He was laughing and joking with beings from a dozen different species, making friends with ease. In the Cultural Exchange Center, Maria Santos was learning languages. Her instructors were amazed at how quickly she absorbed new information. She had already mastered 3 alien tongues and was working on a 4th. She asked questions constantly, wanting to know everything about every species she encountered in the security training facility. Jake Morrison was demonstrating human combat techniques to a group of station guards. He moved with terrifying speed and precision, putting opponents twice his size on the ground with simple movements. The guards watched with a mixture of awe and fear. Kelthos returned to his quarters and sat in the darkness for a long time. The humans were not what he had expected. They were not mindless monsters or ruthless conquerors. They were curious and friendly and eager to learn. But underneath that friendly surface was something else. Something forged in the fires of a hostile world. Something that had survived everything that world could throw at it. The precursors had created Terra as a crucible. They had designed it to produce the ultimate survivors, and it had worked better than they could have imagined. The humans were exactly what the Ancient Ones had wanted, a species that could not be broken, could not be stopped, could not be defeated. Kelthos wondered what would happen when the galaxy truly understood what humanity was capable of. He suspected they would find out soon enough, and he was not sure whether to be excited or terrified by that thought. The ancient chart had warned of monsters, but these monsters could smile and shake hands and make jokes. These monsters could adapt to any situation and overcome any obstacle. These monsters had survived a world designed to kill them, and now they were here, among the stars. Ready to face whatever challenges the universe had to offer, Kelthos looked out his window at the human ship docked nearby. The Endeavor sat there like a sleeping predator, ugly and brutal and utterly confident. It was a perfect reflection of the species that built it. The galaxy would never be the same. Seleth's research had consumed her entire life for the past several weeks. She had abandoned her regular duties at the Cartography Guild. She had stopped eating proper meals. She had barely slept, but she had to know more. The discovery about the precursors and their experiment had opened a door that she could not close. She needed to understand everything. Her search had led her to Crystalis, a world unlike any other in the known galaxy. The planet was covered in massive crystal formations that rose from the ground like frozen towers. But these were not ordinary crystals. They were living memory storage devices, created by a civilization that had died out long before the current spacefaring age. The crystals contained information from dozens of extinct species, preserved forever in their glittering depths. It was the closest thing the galaxy had to a complete historical archive. Seleth had spent 3 days in the Forbidden Archive, a section of Crystalis that contained the oldest and most dangerous knowledge. The crystals there were dark and cold, their surfaces covered in warnings written in languages no one could read anymore. But Seleth had access codes that most researchers did not. Her position in the Cartography Guild gave her clearance to view records that had been sealed for thousands of cycles. What she found there changed everything she thought she knew about the universe. The precursors had not simply marked the forbidden sector as dangerous. They had documented their entire experiment in careful detail. Seleth read their reports with growing horror. She saw the world they had designed, a planet of extreme conditions where survival was never guaranteed. She saw the life forms they had seeded there, primitive organisms that would evolve over millions of years. She saw their predictions about what might eventually emerge, and she saw their fear. The precursors had been the most advanced civilization the galaxy had ever known. They had possessed technology that seemed like magic to modern species. They could reshape planets. They could create life from nothing. They could travel between stars in the blink of an eye. They had believed themselves to be gods, but as they watched their experiment unfold, they began to understand their mistake. The life on Terra was not evolving the way they expected. It was not becoming passive and peaceful like most species in the galaxy. It was becoming aggressive, competitive, ruthless. Every generation was stronger than the last. Every species that emerged was more dangerous than the ones before. The world was a never-ending war for survival, and only the most capable warriors survived. The precursors tried to intervene. They modified the environment to make it less hostile. They introduced calming influences into the ecosystem. They did everything they could to slow down the process, but it was too late. Evolution had its own momentum. The creatures of Terra continued to grow stronger and smarter and more determined. And then the humans. Seleth read the precursor reports about early humanity with her hearts pounding in her chest. The ancient beings had observed humans for thousands of years. They had watched them spread across Terra, adapting to every environment they encountered. They had watched them learn to use tools and fire and language. They had watched them begin to ask questions about the stars. Above them, the precursors had realized that they had created something unprecedented. The humans were not just survivors. They were problem solvers. They could look at any challenge and find a way to overcome it. They could work together in groups, combining their individual strengths to achieve things that no single being could accomplish. They could pass knowledge from one generation to the next, building on the achievements of their ancestors, and most terrifying of all, they never stopped trying. Other species might give up when faced with impossible odds. Humans did not. They would fight until they won or died, and even death was not always enough to stop them. Their determination was beyond anything the precursors had ever seen. The final entries in the archive were written in haste. Selith could see the fear in every word. The precursors had decided to seal the experiment. They could not destroy Terra without destroying themselves in the process, as the energies involved would tear the galaxy apart. So they did the next best thing. They marked the region on every chart they could find. They placed warnings in every language they knew. They told all future civilizations to stay away from that small spiral arm on the edge of the galaxy, and then they vanished. Selith did not know what had happened to the precursors. No one did. But she suspected that they had run. They had created a monster they could not control, and they had fled rather than face the consequences. She gathered her findings and prepared a message for the council. They needed to know the truth. They needed to understand that the humans were not just another species seeking friendship among the stars. They were the product of millions of years of intentional design. They were exactly what the precursors had wanted to create, the ultimate survivors. But as she wrote her report, another thought occurred to her. The humans had been contained on Terra for millions of years. They had evolved and grown and developed in isolation, never knowing that the wider galaxy existed. And despite that isolation, despite having no enemies from the stars to fight, they had continued to evolve. They had continued to become stronger and smarter and more capable. What would happen now that they were free? Back on Nexus Station, the human delegation was settling into their new role as galactic ambassadors. Lisa Hartwell spent her days in meetings with council members, answering questions and asking many of her own. She was patient and polite and always willing to explain human customs and history. But Kelthos noticed something behind her calm demeanor. She was studying them, learning their weaknesses and strengths, filing away information for future use. Danny Kim had become popular in the lower levels of the station. He had a gift for making friends and telling stories. He made people laugh. He made them comfortable. And while they were laughing and relaxing, he was watching them with sharp, clever eyes. Maria Santos had mastered 7 alien languages in just a few weeks. Her instructors said she learned faster than anyone they had ever taught. She seemed to absorb information like a sponge absorbs water, effortlessly and completely. Jake Morrison had started training with the station's security forces. He was teaching them human combat techniques, but Kelthos suspected he was also learning their techniques. He was adapting, improving, preparing for threats that might not even exist yet. This was what humans did, Selith realized as she finished her report. They did not simply exist in new environments. They did not simply survive. They dominated. They took whatever situation they found themselves in and bent it to their will. They were not content to merely live. They had to win. The precursors had understood this. That was why they had been so afraid. They had created a species that could never be satisfied, could never be contained, could never be stopped. A species that would keep pushing forward until they had conquered. Every challenge in the universe, Selith sent a report to the council and sat back in her chair. The crystals of the Forbidden Archive glittered around her, holding secrets that most beings would never know. She thought about the humans and their brutal world. She thought about the precursors and their terrible mistake. She thought about the future and what it might hold. The ancient chart had said, "Here be monsters." The precursors had put that warning there millions of years ago, hoping it would keep the galaxy safe. But warnings only worked if people listened to them. The humans were free now. They were spreading out among the stars, making friends and learning everything they could about their new neighbors. They seemed friendly and curious and eager to cooperate, but Seleth knew what they really were, and she suspected that the galaxy would learn soon enough. The experiment had escaped containment. The monsters were loose, and the universe would never be the same. The Kreth came without warning on a morning that had started like any other. Their massive hive ships emerged from dark space in the outer territories, thousands of vessels appearing where nothing had been moments before. They were an ancient terror, a species that existed only to consume. They had destroyed dozens of civilizations throughout galactic history, feeding on entire worlds before returning to dormancy for centuries at a time. The galaxy's expansion into new territories had finally reached their sleeping grounds, and now they were awake. The first distress calls reached Nexus Station within hours. Colony worlds were going silent, their populations vanishing in waves of darkness. Defense fleets were being overwhelmed, their weapons unable to penetrate Kreth armor. The creatures adapted to every attack, learning and evolving in real time. What worked against them once never worked again. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session. Elder Morveth stood before the assembled delegates with his ancient shell trembling. He had seen Kreth attacks before, long ago in his youth. He knew what was coming. We must evacuate the threatened sectors, Morveth announced. We must pull back our populations and establish defensive lines. The Kreth cannot be fought. They can only be avoided. If we sacrifice enough territory, they will eventually return to dormancy. It was the same strategy that had worked in the past. Let the Kreth consume what they wanted. Wait for them to sleep. Rebuild what was lost. It was not heroic, but it was practical. It was survival. Lisa Hartwell stood up from the human delegation's seats. The chamber fell silent. Everyone knew who she was. Everyone had heard the stories about humanity and their terrible world. Everyone was curious about what she would say. No, Lisa said. The word was simple and quiet, but it carried through the entire chamber. Morveth's mandibles clicked in confusion. You do not understand, human? The Kreth have been a threat for longer than your species has existed. They adapt to every weapon. They learn from every battle. They cannot be defeated. Lisa walked down to the center of the chamber. She moved slowly, deliberately, giving everyone time to watch her. She was small compared to most species present. She had no natural weapons, no armor, no obvious physical advantages. But something in the way she carried herself made several delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. Everything can be defeated, Lisa said. Everything can be killed. You just have to find the right way to do it. And you know this way? Morveth asked, his tone skeptical. Lisa smiled. It was not a friendly smile. Not yet. But we'll figure it out. That's what we do. She turned to face the entire council. My people did not survive Terra by running away from threats. We survived by facing them, by studying them, by finding their weaknesses and exploiting them. The Kreth are just another predator. We've dealt with predators before. She pulled up images on the main display. Creatures from Terra, sharks that ruled the oceans, tigers that stalked the jungles, bears that dominated the forests, microscopic organisms that killed billions, natural disasters that reshaped continents. Killed all of these, Lisa continued. Or we tamed them. Or we adapted to live alongside them. We did whatever we had to do to survive. And we'll do the same thing to the Kreth. 3 days later, human warships began arriving through the sealed hyperlanes. They were not diplomatic vessels. They were not exploration craft. They were machines of destruction, ugly and brutal, and heavily armed. Their names told stories of human history: the defiance, the relentless, the never again, the remember, the unconquered. The human fleet was small, 30 ships against a Kreth swarm that numbered in the thousands. The council members who watched the fleet assemble assumed it was a gesture of solidarity, nothing more. A symbolic show of support before the inevitable retreat. They were wrong. The first engagement happened at Pyrrhus Colony, a small world on the edge of Kreth territory. The swarm had already consumed 3 nearby planets. They were confident, hungry, unstoppable. They had never encountered anything they could not overwhelm. The human fleet attacked without warning and without mercy. Their weapons were primitive by galactic standards. Kinetic accelerators that threw chunks of metal at incredible speeds, nuclear warheads that turned space into fire, antimatter torpedoes that erased matter from existence. They were crude, brutal, effective. The Kreth had never faced anything like human aggression. They were accustomed to prey that fled, that surrendered, that died quietly. The humans did none of these things. They charged into the swarm with weapons blazing. They took damage that would have crippled any other fleet and kept fighting. When their ships were too damaged to continue, their crews would aim at the largest Kreth vessel and accelerate to ramming speed. Danny Kim died at Pyrrhus. His small fighter was surrounded by Kreth interceptors. Instead of ejecting, instead of surrendering, he flew directly into the core of a hive ship. The explosion killed thousands of Kreth. His last transmission was a single word: "Gotcha." Maria Santos lost her left arm pulling survivors from a burning deck. She refused medical evacuation and continued working, helping to coordinate the battle with one hand while blood soaked through her. Bandages. Jake Morrison led 3 boarding actions during the engagement. When his weapons ran out of ammunition, he killed Kreth with his bare hands. He was found after the battle surrounded by alien ARPCs, still breathing, still fighting, still refusing to stop. The Kreth adapted, as they always did. They learned to counter human weapons. They developed new tactics to deal with human aggression. They became harder to kill with each passing hour, so the humans adapted faster. They studied, captured Kreth biology and engineered viruses that targeted their nervous systems. They analyzed Kreth communication signals and filled their channels with confusion and false orders. They discovered that Kreth hive ships could be turned against each other with precisely calibrated electromagnetic pulses. They used every tool, every trick, every dirty tactic they could think of. The war lasted for 3 months. The humans lost half their fleet. Thousands of soldiers died, but they kept fighting. They kept adapting. They kept refusing to accept defeat. The final battle happened in the Crimson Nebula, a cloud of gas and dust that glowed red with the light of dying stars. The Kreth Queen ship was there, the massive vessel that controlled the entire swarm. Killing the Queen would throw the Kreth into chaos. It would end the war. Lisa Hartwell commanded the remnants of the human fleet. The Endeavor was falling apart around her. Life support was failing. Half her crew was dead. The ship could barely move, barely fight, barely survive. She ordered ramming speed. The Endeavor hit the Queen ship at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The explosion was visible from worlds hundreds of light years away. It lit up the Crimson Nebula like a second sun. The Kreth swarm felt their queen die. Without her guidance, without her control, they lost all coordination. They turned on each other in confusion. They fled back into dark space, scattering in every direction. The war was over. The galaxy had been saved, and the humans had proven exactly what they were capable of. On Nexus Station, the surviving council members watched the final battle footage in stunned silence. They saw the Endeavor make its final charge. They saw the explosion that ended the Kreth threat. They saw what humans were willing to sacrifice to protect species they had only just met. Elder Morvith was the first to speak. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "Called them monsters," he said. "We were not wrong. But perhaps monsters are exactly what the galaxy needed." The ancient chart had warned of creatures too terrible to face. The precursors had sealed them away in fear. But when the real monsters came, when the Kreth threatened to consume everything, it was the humans who stood in their way. It was the humans who fought back. It was the humans who won. The memorial service was held on Nexus Station. 6 months after the end of the Kreth War, representatives from every civilized world came to honor the humans, who had died defending species they had barely known. The station's central chamber was filled with beings of every shape and size, all gathered to pay their respects to the small, fragile creatures who had saved the galaxy. The list of names was long. Danny Kim, the crew of the Defiance, the soldiers who had boarded Kreth's ships knowing they would not return, and Lisa Hartwell, whose final act had ended the war and whose body had never been recovered from the burning. Remains of the Endeavor, Kelta stood near the front of the crowd, watching the ceremony with all four of his eyes. He had known Lisa for only a few months, but she had changed the way he saw the universe. She had shown him what courage truly looked like, not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The new human ambassador was a quiet man named Carlos Vega. He had lost his family at Pyrrhus Colony during the first days of the war. His wife, his 2 children. Everyone he had loved was gone, but he had not broken. He had not surrendered to despair. He had picked up the work that Lisa had started and continued it without complaint. That was what humans did, Kelthos had learned. They suffered terrible losses and kept going. They faced impossible odds and refused to quit. They bent but did not break. No matter how hard the universe pushed them, Carlos stepped up to the podium when the list of names had been read. He looked out at the assembled crowd with tired eyes that had seen too much death. But his voice was steady when he spoke. "We didn't come to the stars looking for friends," he said. "We came because staying on one world was too dangerous. Everything that has ever threatened life on Terra is still there. Asteroids that could end all life in an instant. Volcanoes that could block out the sun. Diseases that could kill billions. And our own worst impulses, our capacity for violence and destruction that we have never fully controlled." He paused, letting his words sink in. We needed to spread out. We needed to have more than one home, so that if something happened to Terra, humanity would survive. That's why we came to the stars. Not for glory, not for conquest. For survival? Carlos pulled up a new image on the main display. It was a star chart, but not like any chart the galaxy had seen before. It did not show trade routes or territorial boundaries. It showed threats. Every dangerous region of space, every hostile species, every environmental hazard in the known galaxy, everything that could kill. We're going to deal with all of these, Carlos continued, one by one. We're going to make this galaxy safe. Not because we're heroes, not because we're special, because we're terrified. We've always been terrified. It's what keeps us alive. The crowd was silent. No one knew how to respond. No species had ever made such a promise before. No species had ever tried to eliminate every threat in the galaxy. The task was impossible. It would take centuries. It might never be completed. But as Kelthos looked at the human ambassador, he realized that Carlos meant every word. The humans were not making an empty promise. They were announcing a mission, a purpose, a reason to exist. They were going to protect the galaxy. Because that was what survivors did. In the months that followed, human ships spread out across civilized space. They brought engineers to help rebuild colony worlds. Destroyed by the Kreth, they brought doctors to share medical advances that humanity had developed, fighting the endless diseases of Terra. They brought soldiers to train defense forces, teaching smaller species how to fight back against threats they had always fled. The humans asked for nothing in return. They did not demand tribute or territory. They did not seek to conquer or dominate. They simply helped, because helping made the galaxy safer. And a safer galaxy meant a better chance of survival. Seleth watched the transformation from her office on Nethris Prime. She had become something of an expert on humanity since her discovery in the Forbidden Archive. She had written papers about their evolution, their psychology, their strange combination of aggression and compassion. She had tried to explain to the galaxy what the humans truly were, but she was not sure she fully understood them. Herself, the precursors had designed Terra to produce the ultimate survivors. They had expected those survivors to be ruthless, selfish, interested only in their own preservation. And in some ways, they had been right. Humans were capable of terrible violence. They had nearly destroyed themselves many times throughout their history, but the precursors had missed something. They had not understood that survival was not just about killing threats. It was also about building communities, about helping others, about creating something worth surviving for. Humans were dangerous. That was beyond question. But they were also capable of great kindness, great sacrifice, great love. They would fight to the death for strangers. They would give everything they had to protect those weaker than themselves. They would face any danger, endure any hardship, pay any price to keep others safe. The precursors had created monsters. But they had created monsters with hearts. On Terra itself, in a small building in a city called Washington, an ancient map hung under protective glass. It was a relic from humanity's past, from a time when they had only explored a fraction of their own world. The unknown regions were marked with a phrase that had followed them to the stars: "Here be monsters." A young girl stood before the map, looking up at the faded words with curious eyes. Her father stood beside her, holding her hand. "Daddy, what does that mean?" she asked. He smiled and knelt down beside her. "It means there's something out there waiting to be discovered. Something dangerous. Something exciting. Something we haven't faced yet." Were there really monsters there? Sometimes. But we found out that the monsters weren't as scary as we thought. And when they were scary, we figured out how to deal with them. That's what humans do, sweetheart. We face the things that frighten us, and we overcome them. The girl thought about this for a moment. Are there monsters in space too? Her father looked out the window at the stars that were just becoming visible in the evening sky. Yes, but we're taking care of them. Making space safe for everyone, that sounds hard. It is. But we don't give up, no matter how hard things get. We never have. We never will. On Nexus Station, the Galactic Council voted to update the official star charts. The ancient warning that had kept ships away from Terra for millions of years was finally removed. In its place, a new marking was added. It read, "Here be humans. Approach with hope." Elder Morveth, who had been so afraid of the humans when they first arrived, cast the deciding vote. He was old now, older than almost any living member of his species. He had seen empires rise and fall. He had watched civilizations bloom and wither. But he had never seen anything like humanity. They were made to be monsters, he said after the vote. The precursors designed them to survive anything, to overcome any obstacle, to defeat any enemy. But somewhere along the way, they became something more. They became protectors. They became friends. He looked at the human delegation, at Carlos Vega and the soldiers and scientists who had come to represent their species. The ancient chart said, "Here be monsters," but it was just Terra, just a small world with stubborn creatures who refused to die. And now those creatures are out among the stars, making the galaxy safer for all of us. Morveth bowed his head, a gesture of respect among his people. Perhaps monsters were exactly what we needed all along. Outside the station, human ships continued their work. They patrolled dangerous regions. They responded to distress calls. They fought threats that other species were too frightened to face. They did what they had always done. They survived. And they helped others survive too. That was what humans were. Monsters with hearts. Survivors who protected. The children of a world designed to kill them, now spreading across the galaxy to make sure nothing else had to face the same struggle alone. The ancient chart had warned of terrible things in that small spiral arm of the galaxy. But the terrible things had turned out to be humanity's greatest gift. They had turned out to be hope.